Hello, class. I hope this message and video finds you happy, healthy, safe, and sound. This is our last main week of learning for this semester, and I saved the hardest for last, the most controversial, which is U.S. foreign policy. So, because there's so much we could focus on, but not enough time to focus on all of those things, I've narrowed it down to one major topic, which is, and this will be our main topic of foreign policy for the semester. And if this is interesting to you, you could definitely take a comparative politics class, world politics, international relations, or all of the above. But since we're doing American politics, this lecture is going to be concerning the United States' greatest ally. And when I say greatest, I mean closest ally, and that is the country of Israel. So, what this lecture is going to look at is why is the US so close to Israel? What are the controversies? Because if you've been watching all my lectures this semester, you know I'm not going to take one side or the other. So, what are both sides of this issue? And we'll go from there. All right. So, first thing you need to know to start out is that the country of Israel, as it is known today, was formed in the modern world in 1948. Why that's important is because of what it came after. And it came after the end of World War II. So this is just to throw it out there. This is a very intense topic. Um, we will talk about religion and in a way that's it's a very sensitive and personal issue. So I only bring it up to the extent that it's relevant to politics. I'm not taking sides in any way, as I said, and not everyone in the religions we talk about believes exactly what I'm speaking of, but they're general doctrines that are largely held by three different religions, which we'll talk about today: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. All right. So first, we have to start though with 1948, and what happened in World War II. We all know, unfortunately, was that the big part in Europe was there was Hitler who had taken over many countries and ended up killing 6 million Jewish people. So, if you wonder why is there a controversy at all surrounding Israel, you could start with that. In World War II, 6 million Jewish people were killed by the Nazis. As a result of that, as a direct result of that, the US, England, and other allies in the West specifically pushed for and got Israel to its current location. Now, this is where the controversy begins because who was in Israel in 1947? Before 1948, who was there? And that is the Palestinians, Palestine. Palestine, the best way I can explain it, because of the sort of limited nature of how much we have time to learn for foreign policy, having it just be sort of one chapter out of dozen plus that we've covered. The most the Probably the best way I could say it, or the most accurate way, is the Palestinian people who lived there before 1948. When 1948 came and there was a push to have Israel become a country formally recognized by the United Nations, etc., which was formerly the League of Nations, there was a question of, okay, so what happens to the people who are already in what is now going to be Israel? What happens to Palestinian people? Largely Muslim, and what's going to happen? Because either Israel doesn't get what they claim is their country back, or they get it back at the expense of people living there. So, what happened? The best way to describe it, based on what we've learned in our classes, like eminent domain. If you all remember, eminent domain is that idea. And again, I'm not taking any sides here. But the idea is that there was a pressing need for Jewish people to have what they were referring to as their country back. Okay, so others would disagree and say it was never your country, and some would say it absolutely was. But here's what ended up happening: that Israel was put where it is on the map, and this is your one assignment. Go look on a map, world map, and find Israel. It's a very small country. Palestine is inside and sharing land with Israel right now, but there are massive human rights concerns. I could probably do a whole lecture on that just in and of itself. But this is what you need to know for this lecture. Palestinians were living in Israel until 1948, at which time the essence of eminent domain, which is in the United States is under the Fifth Amendment, is what was used as the reasoning. Say that there's a compelling interest to have Jewish people have a homeland that they call their own that is safe, and so what's the result of that? Immediate controversy. Why? Because someone was living where Israel now is. And so Palestinians, and this is where I want you to see both sides, it's very important. Is it possible that you might say, I'm unbelievably sad and sorry for what happened to 6 million Jewish people? It's reprehensible, it's an unbelievable tragedy, period. Next paragraph. Why do I have to leave my home? I didn't do it. I have nothing to do. I didn't want it to happen. I would have fought to help it, prevent it if I could. So that's the Palestinian side, right? And again, I know this is incredibly controversial, so I'm going to stay as neutral as humanly possible. So the Palestinian argument was, look, make Israel somewhere else, not where I live. And it's not due to lack of sympathy. That's very important to understand. It's not due to lack of sympathy. It's due to a disagreement over whose land it is. And that's why we get into religion now, because without talking about religion, you can't really understand why Israel is so controversial. And if you haven't noted this yet, or if I haven't really made it clear, the fact that the United States is so close to Israel as an ally, that they consider Israel the greatest ally, unflappable, totally fettered. I was going to say unfettered, that means not bound together, but fettered means bound together. And another reason, so we have World War II, right? And we just discussed that. The U.S. goes in and helps defeat the Nazis, and the Soviet Union helped to defeat the Nazis in the freezing cold winter leading up to the Nazis' defeat. So to be fair to history, it's both the United States and the USSR that were able to stop the Nazis. But in the post-World War II world, which was 1948, when the United Nations is formed, there's an immediate split in the world. USSR is one superpower and USA is the other. And that's kind of where things landed. So with religion, the United States at the time, if you looked at polls over the course of the last 60 to 70 years, you'll see a slight gradual decline, steady, slight gradual decline in how many people in the United States call themselves Christians. So this is really important. This isn't me or some other political scientist labeling people. This is like when we talked about polls and surveys, people are asked, what religion are you? And they're allowed to answer nothing, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, anything, whatever they really feel. That's what you want to know, right? If you're doing a poll. So those polls for a long time showed that more than 9 out of 10 people in the United States considered themselves a Christian. That's how they identified themselves religiously. And so that's the first thing you want to look at as to why would the U.S. support Israel in such controversial place and such a just such a general controversy. The average American voter said that they were Christian. And you would say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Here's where we have to learn a little bit about world religion. Christian doctrine generally teaches, again, not every Christian is going to believe this, but the general doctrine of Christianity teaches that if you, meaning your country, your government, support Israel, that God will bless you. And if you curse Israel, God will curse you. So it's pretty simple from a Christian perspective, religiously, in this political sense. You, as a Christian, if you are one, are supposed to support Israel. Why? Because you believe they're God's chosen people. It's written in the Bible that if you curse Israel, God will curse you. If you bless them, he will bless you. So, one of the most important groups of people in terms of support for Israel um, are evangelical Christians in the United States. It's really important you understand why. Why would Christians support Jewish people so vociferously, so intensely, so passionately, and so politically? And the answer is because there's a belief in the doctrine of Christianity that says it's God's chosen people. If you don't bless them, someone else will, but you'll be cursed. So that that sort of sets the foundation. Now, Islam is going to come into this immediately because, and I'm hoping that all of you know something about Islam. It's important to know about all world religions, but if you didn't, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam. So there's Mecca, where you were supposed to take a Hajj, which is an Arabic word for a journey to Mecca, if you're able to go to afford it. A Hajj is in Mecca. Then there's Medina, and then the third holiest site in Islam is Jerusalem. Again, not every Muslim person is going to believe this, but it's the general doctrine that we're trying to get at so you can understand it. Okay, so you have Islam then with the belief that Jerusalem, which is now where the U.S. Embassy is, and many people would consider the capital of Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. You have that as the third holiest site in Islam. And here's where it gets even more controversial. The third holiest site in Islam is what we would call in English the Dome of the Rock. And that is a mosque where that was built where it is believed that Muhammad ascended to heaven. Now, another quick thing that's important to know about Islam: Muhammad is not the same as Jesus in the Muslim religion vis-a-vis Christianity. In other words, Christians believe that Jesus is the literal Son of God, and he died for people's sins, and if you believe that, you go to heaven. And Muslims, however, do not believe that Muhammad is God. If you think that, erase that thought. It's not the teaching of Islam. The teaching is that Muhammad is the prophet, the final prophet. And in fact, it's so important that you understand that it's not the same as the Christian understanding of Jesus. It's forbidden to draw pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. If you want to look at some intense news about this, just Google France and see what's going on. And just to be clear, I am not in any way whatsoever advocating that you depict or draw or make a picture of Muhammad, because I don't want to disrespect any religion ever. So, but I'm telling you that when people do that, it's considered unbelievably offensive. So Muhammad is not God, but is believed to be the final prophet for Islam, and his ascension to heaven from Jerusalem in the belief of Islam is incredibly holy, making it the third holiest site in Islam. So, just so you're clear, Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Muslim people the religion in general would say that Jesus did exist, but he never actually claimed to be all the things that Christians believe he claimed. Those writings were perverted. The Bible is not actually the Word of God. Instead, if you're Muslim, in Islam, the Quran would be the Word of God that you would accept. And then we have Judaism. So one cool thing is all three of these religions actually have more in common than they have distinct. In other words, there's a belief in one God, so monotheism as opposed to polytheism. So belief in one God. Judaism would say, Jesus wasn't the Savior. The Savior is going to come. Now add all this together, and you have, remember, Islam's third holiest site is this mosque, the Dome of the Rock, as we say in English. Underneath and surrounding it is the rubble from what is used to be, in the belief of Judaism and Christianity, the Temple of Solomon. If you don't know who that is, just a quick bloodline check from a religious perspective would show you Solomon is David's son. David is the person that wrote the Psalms of the Bible and is in the bloodline of Jesus. So stay with me. You have Islam that believes that Muhammad, the final prophet, went back up to heaven from Jerusalem. And then you have Judaism and Christianity believing that the Dome of the Rock, which is the mosque that represents where Muhammad ascended to heaven, Christians and Jews believe that that temple that is in rubble right now is going to be rebuilt. And that when it is rebuilt, that will signal the end of the world, literally. So now you know how intense this topic is. What would have to happen for the Temple of Solomon, the bloodline of Jesus, and if you're Jewish, you wouldn't put emphasis on Jesus. You would put emphasis on the coming Savior. But there's a shared mutual interest between Christians and Jews, which is that that temple is at some point rebuilt. What would have to happen for that to happen? Well, the Dome of the Rock would have to be razed, R-A-Z-E-D. Again, I'm not advocating for anything. Razed means destroyed. So that is an unbelievably controversial thing that we've just talked about here, right? So you have a religion that believes in Christianity that believes that Jewish people are God's chosen people. The Savior of Jesus was Jewish, and you're supposed to bless the Jewish nation or you will be cursed. Then you have Muslim religion that teaches Jerusalem's the third holiest site, and that the Dome of the Rock is a very sacred place because Muhammad ascended to heaven from there. That mosque should not be destroyed. And then you have the Jewish teaching, which is that temple is going to be rebuilt, and it's just sort of a matter of time. So that is my mini world religions lecture. There's so much more we could talk about, and if this is interesting to you, I'd really encourage you to take not just my class, but whatever professors you can find that are willing to teach honestly about both sides. Take world religions class, take world politics, comparative politics classes. It's so important. So let's put it this way. The average American today, it's not 9 out of 10 anymore. It's about 75% of people. About 3 out of every 4 American voters says they identify as Christian. So you can understand why the U.S. generally has a policy that's amicable towards Israel still, because the average voter self-identifies as Christian, and we already discussed that Christians believe that they're supposed to support Israel, right? Now there's a huge controversy again because Palestine was there and is there, but Palestinians, if we want to put it in U.S. constitutional terms, Palestinians have basically no Fourth Amendment rights, which is, if you remember, the right not to be searched or seized, have your stuff searched or seized by the government. There are massive human rights concerns from neutral observers, not just people who are against Israel or pro-Palestinian, but just neutral observers would say there's real human rights concerns with how Palestinians are treated. I don't have time to get into that with you all, but again, I encourage you to read more about it and take another class where the whole class focuses on world politics, because we only get 1 week, so it's pretty tough to cover it too comprehensively. But I hope that makes sense so far, so we can move on. So religion is what makes Israel such a controversial place, especially Jerusalem, because you have the 3 main monotheistic religions in the world, which means they believe in one God, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all saying that Jerusalem is precious and holy to them. But it's only one place, and so you can't everyone can't have what they want, if that makes sense. It's impossible. So And that's why the controversy is so big regarding religion in that part of the world. Okay, so that's the background on why. So you have World War II, 6 million Jews are killed. Then you have what is more or less considered a Christian nation. Again, that doesn't mean that everyone actually believes it, that everyone actually goes to church every week. We're just saying in a poll, who do you identify as religiously? What do you identify as? And if people say Christian, then we get a poll that says that. And if people say they're atheist, then we know. So you all remember how we do polls accurately. That was a whole week of going through that. So, but about 3 out of every 4 American voters generally considers themselves Christian. So that's why, if you ask, well, why, if it's so controversial, do we still support Israel? I would argue that that's one of the big reasons. And the other reason is that I mentioned briefly that evangelical Christians who, we've talked about this before, who are almost exclusively Republican, probably because of the issue, not probably, definitely because of the issue of pro-life, anti-abortion, um, however you would want to say that issue, but they're also incredibly pro-Israel. So we talked about groups that of lobbyists and interest groups. Lobbyists and interest groups for Israel are funded in large part by evangelical Christians. And so, if you want to know, as you're writing these things down, why is the U.S. still supporting? Well, you have strong, intense lobbying that's going on to keep the policies of the United States pro-Israeli. And they're being funded in large measure by evangelical Christians who believe it's their religious duty to support Israel. Meanwhile, you have Muslims who are in that country, in Palestine, and not necessarily receiving human rights, especially those who live there as opposed to who visit from the US. This is such a controversial issue, and I encourage you to go look this up as well, that Representative Omar from Minnesota, she mentioned some of her feelings about Israel, and she's a Democrat. And Nancy Pelosi, who is the lead Democrat in the country right now, still the third most powerful person until Biden and Kamala Harris are sworn in. Actually, she'll remain that third most powerful person right now, besides Trump and Pence. She and a lot of other people in Congress did something called censure, CENSURE. They censured Representative Omar because she made comments on Twitter and online that people said were anti-Semitic. If you've never heard that term, anti-Semitic means anti-Jewish. I'm not going to take any side in this other than to say I don't know what her intent was. I don't know anything other than this, that the fact that other Democrats were willing to censure her, which is basically like a slap on the wrist in Congress. It's a way of saying we disapprove of what you've done. It's not quite impeachment, but it's like the light version of that. So she's still serving, but just the mention of Israel is extremely controversial in U.S. politics. Obama was arguably just as pro-Israel as Trump was, and just as pro-Israel as Bill Clinton, and just as pro-Israel as Ronald Reagan. It is not something that changes when the new president comes in, not substantively. In other words, maybe a little bit here and there, but the actual core policy of the United States, foreign policy, which is this point of this lecture, is pro-Israel. So, and you just need to know this as in summary of the religious part. If for no other reason, it's because of their deeply held religious beliefs around Israel, and all 3 of these religions that find Jerusalem holy for their own reasons, they all can't have what they want because it's one place, right? So next, why else is the U.S. such good friends with Israel? Let's move past religion now. This is a really interesting theory I want to teach you guys, and it's one of the simplest theories to learn. And it has some very intense support from people in the United States, but it also has some flaws. So the theory that guides the United States is called the Democratic Peace Theory, the DPT, Democratic Peace Theory. And what that means is the belief that the more democracies there are on Earth, the more peaceful the world will be. So, what's the proof of that? What's the proof that if we have tons of democracies in the world, that the world will be more peaceful? Here's the proof that is offered up by people who believe in this theory. No two democracies have ever fought each other. Have democracies gone to war? Yep. The United States is still in war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Arguably, some would say we're not still at war, but there are troops there, right? So the US and many, many other democratic countries have gone to war, but not with each other. So the democratic peace theory says what? It says democracies don't fight each other. It's never happened in the history of the world. So if all countries become democracies, there will be no more war because democracies don't fight each other. They have too much in common. And you all know this from the first couple weeks of the semester, things like capitalism and free trade, generally speaking, and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these types of things, right? So the other reason that the U.S. supports Israel is because they're a democracy. Now, you could argue, how democratic are they, Professor V, if you're saying that there are people in the country, Palestinians specifically, that don't really have full human rights. They don't have anything like a Fourth Amendment right. They have limited First Amendment type of rights, meaning ability to, without consequence, be critical of the Israeli government. I mean, it's a great question. It'd be a great dissertation. So I encourage you to look into that if you like. But so the democratic peace theory. Now we get back to, if that wasn't controversial enough for you, now we'll dive into something very controversial. The Israeli country, Israel, is the only country on earth that has what is referred to as an undeclared nuclear arsenal. They're the only undeclared nuclear power in the world. What does that mean? That means that they have nuclear weapons. Well, what are nuclear weapons? Most of you probably know the United States and Russia have the most. The whole Cold War between World War II and the 90s was about the USSR and the USA getting more and more and more and more nuclear weapons. And it was so severe that you probably heard about the potential for World War III that could have happened when USSR had nuclear missiles pointed at Florida, around Cuba, and JFK was president at the time, and it was a scary thing. And there was one principle that kept the world from going to nuclear war with each other, and it was called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction. And that means what? That means if the US dropped a nuclear bomb on USSR, within as short a period of time as you can imagine, the USSR would have dropped 5 bombs on the US. And then the US would have retaliated and dropped more, and the whole world would have been dead. I mean, I know it might sound a little bit exaggerated, but it's not really that much of an exaggeration. Nuclear weapons are a huge deal. There are less than 10 countries in the world that have them. So here's, if you want a little assignment, you can go look up, besides the USA, besides Russia, and besides Israel, which they don't say they have nukes, but they don't say they don't. So when you ask the Israeli government, what kind of nukes do you have? Do you have nukes? They will say, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of a nuclear program. What does that mean? We have it, but we're not going to explicitly say it. Okay? So then you have, I'll give you a few more, but North Korea, India, Pakistan, and then you can go look up a couple other ones, China, of course. And this is where it gets to be really controversial, is Iran, and they're not going to make the list of nuclear powers. Iran is outside of the list. They don't have nuclear power. They don't have nuclear weapons. The problem is that it looks like favoritism to much of the world that Israel, the only country in the Middle East that has nukes, is the one that's the closest to the United States in terms of an ally. Does that make sense? So around the world, it's seen and perceived that the U.S. is playing favorites with Israel, giving them cover to have nuclear weapons, Meanwhile, going after Iran, going to war in Iraq for weapons that they did not even have. They never had nukes. We just got it wrong. I don't know that I've ever criticized a candidate for office, but just so you know, Joe Biden voted to authorize the war in Iraq. Now, to be fair, Trump was for it as well. Until it became unpopular, then they were both against it. Why am I telling you this? Because it's important that you know that back in 2003, there was a sentiment, it was wrong, it was incorrect. I don't know that it was a lie, but I know that it was incorrect. There was a sentiment, feeling, concern, intelligence that said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, meaning specifically in this case, nuclear weapons. We went to war, they didn't have any. Okay? So you might say, what does that mean in terms of Israel? Well, it means a lot because we were willing to go to war for 15 plus years over a nuclear weapon that wasn't even there. But Israel, on the other hand, has an undeclared nuclear arsenal, and the US doesn't do anything one way or the other. So does that make sense in terms of the controversy? Now, Iran, I'll just briefly go over this. The way that you make nuclear power to turn on the lights in your home, to watch Netflix, and to have your refrigerator be cold, nuclear power can do that with basically no pollution, and it's a fairly safe way of having power, especially in terms of it doesn't have carbon emissions and it doesn't necessarily hurt the planet, like burning coal or things like that, right? So Iran has nuclear power based on a treaty that was signed in the 70s, and they're allowed to have nuclear power because why shouldn't they be able to use a clean energy source? But here's where the U.S. has a problem: is the U.S. government is what I'm referring to, right? For all of this, we're referring to the governments, not the people per se. The same process by which you make nuclear power, which turns on your lights, is the same process that you use to make a nuclear bomb. The only difference is that as you're enriching this uranium, which is beyond my scientific ability to explain, when you enrich it, it basically, they call it yellow cake or yellow dirt. To a scientist who was just killed in Iran, it could potentially mean that you're going to make power for the country to turn on people's lights and electricity, but the same process can also be used if you keep enriching up to 90% or more. You're going to get to a level where that nuclear essence, the clay, the yellow cake, whatever you want to call it, the uranium, that is going to be so radioactive and so enriched that it can be turned into a bomb. And so the concern among people who are worried about Iran is that they're saying they're using the process just to turn on the lights, but they're actually using it to build a secret nuclear arsenal. Now, just to play Iran's side, they're going to say, first of all, we're not doing that. But second of all, even if we were, Israel has them, and you don't do anything about that. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not taking sides, but you need to understand Iran and the U.S. have a major, major disagreement on this. Trump got the U.S. out of a treaty that we were in, the Iran nuclear deal. Biden has said he's going to get back into this treaty where it gets U.S. people to inspect in Iran different places, nuclear sites, to see if they are in fact making a bomb or if they're just doing what they say they're doing and making nuclear power. I hope that nothing more comes of this, but the fact that a nuclear scientist in Iran was just killed very recently, that's very intense stuff. And the two suspect countries are the U.S. and Israel. And that leads me to another thing that the Israelis and the U.S. have in common, which is common enemies. So the U.S. has really not had a good relationship with Iran since 1979, when they had the Islamic Revolution and took some people hostage, which were later released when Reagan became president. Obama was the first person to pick up the phone and talk to leaders of Iran in my math isn't that good, but about 40 years. But now the relationship is icy again, and the Iranian government doesn't like the U.S. government, and generally speaking, the U.S. government doesn't like Iran. So what does that mean? That means that Israel, as the only democracy in the Middle East, according to U.S. standards by the democratic peace theory, they are a common enemy with the U.S. So the U.S. and Israel don't like Iran and they don't trust them. That's kind of the blunt way to say it. Is that fair? That's not my It's not my question to answer, but it is my question to ask. Is there hypocrisy there? Does the world see it as a double standard? There's certainly countries that do see it that way. Whether you do or not is not up to me, but at least you now know what the controversy is surrounding whether Iran should or can or does have nuclear weapons. A couple more things. Because we have common enemies with Israel and the US have common enemies, we share intelligence with them more than any country on earth. And when we say intelligence, we don't mean smart people or smart things. We mean spy stuff. So when you hear the word intel or intelligence in political science or in my class or from now on in politics, they're talking about spy stuff. So the United States has the CIA, right? And then for Israel, they have what's called the Shin Bet, SHINBET. Okay, so that is their secretive agency, much like the CIA is for the United States. Some of you say, what about the FBI? Just so you know, the FBI is only allowed to do work, their jurisdiction is within the United States. The CIA's jurisdiction is outside of the United States. So they should and have to, after 9/11, work together, the CIA and FBI, if there is a threat that is both domestic and foreign. But in general terms, the FBI is only allowed to deal with domestic threats, while the CIA is going to deal with international threats. You might say, why did we split it up that way? The general quick answer is that the US government didn't want a intelligence agency like the CIA or FBI to be combined together and be just way too powerful. And so there was this idea like a checks and balances almost. And so the CIA and the Shin Bet of Israel, the two intelligence agencies for those countries' foreign affairs, work together to share information on where nuclear scientists are. I don't know if the US or Israel was involved in that killing of the scientists, but it's clear that Iran thinks they were. And so this is really important to know that there's almost no country in the world where you would share the most delicate intelligence with, meaning even about our troops and what military plans we have. There's a very good chance that Israel is going to know about something before the rest of the world does. And if Israel is going to do something against Iran, or if they're going to do something against any country, it's a very, very high probability that they will talk to the U.S. government about it first. So that intelligence sharing that we're talking about is extremely important, and it's also extremely rare. We don't have that kind of relationship with Canada even, or Mexico, I wouldn't think. And that's going back to the thing of, the common enemies. Last but not least, and to summarize, this is really important. What is the side that says, Israel's in the right? Well, people that say Israel is doing fine and not doing anything wrong, they're going to say Israel is a tiny country in the middle of a hostile world that doesn't believe in its existence. The other side is going to say Israel is persecuting Muslims, specifically and especially Muslim people, and not giving them human rights. They've taken their land and they are now oppressing Muslim people specifically, although not only Muslim people. So you see the two sides there. The U.S. is obviously of the side where they support Israel. Every president has since the creation of the modern country of Israel in 1948. But the rest of the world is not so happy. The people that disagree, because they'd say, what about Palestinian rights? Palestine, should have their own autonomous country. They shouldn't be treated the way they are. They should be given Fourth Amendment and First Amendment style rights. And so this is a controversy that is of the most intense magnitude. Arguably, I would say this is the country of Israel and Jerusalem inside of Israel, for as small of a place as it is physically, a physical amount of space, it is probably per square inch the most controversial in the world. I don't think there's almost anyone who would argue with that. So you've got religion, you've got history, World War II specifically, you've got the democratic peace theory, you've got sharing of intelligence, nuclear bombs, and you add all that up, and what do you get? Well, you get a world that's pretty much split. You've got a world that either agrees that Israel has these rights to do what they're doing and to exist, or you have the other side which says they shouldn't even be there. And there are countries, just so you know, like Iran, who won't even acknowledge, they won't even say Israel per se. They'll say the Zionist regime. And they don't mean it in a nice way, they mean it in a pejorative way. That's your word of the day, pejorative. Pejorative means to say something, well, you go look it up, but to say something not just condescending, but with a implied negative. So say something in a pejorative way, like it's kind of a cut down, basically. So you have those two sides. Palestine, who's going to say, where are our rights? Why isn't anyone, if you're so democratic, U.S. and Israel, why aren't you giving us rights? I'll just give you one last example of what some people would consider hypocrisy. When George W. Bush was president and Palestine was having elections, they had two major parties, Fatah and Hamas, and the Hamas party won. And before the election, Bush and Biden and Hillary Clinton and the whole pretty much U.S. apparatus was saying, free and fair elections, that's what makes you a democracy. And then Palestine had free and fair elections, and they chose Hamas, and the U.S. said, Hamas doesn't count as a free and fair election result because they're a terrorist group in our eyes. So, what is the long story short? The people who look at the U.S. and Israel as hypocritical are going to say, you only like us to have free and fair elections when the result goes your way. Now, I do have a little assignment for you. Go look up Iran, the Shah, and the United States. Iran, the Shah, and the United States. That's your little assignment. Go look up why Iran doesn't like the U.S. historically, and why 1979, when the U.S. really stopped having any conversations with them and just became pugnacious and bellicose towards each other. What was it that the U.S. did? And I'll give you a hint, it had something to do with the CIA. It had something to do with free and fair elections in Iran that the U.S. didn't like the result of. And so, just to finish off with my example about Palestine, the Palestinians had an election, they voted, they chose Hamas. The U.S. said, we consider Hamas a terrorist group, therefore it's not a free and fair election because you can't vote for a terrorist, that doesn't count. So the rest of the world who doesn't agree with Israel and the United States said, see, you all are hypocrites. Every time an election goes the way that you like, you leave it alone, and when it goes a way you don't like, then you help to overthrow the leaders or you call it illegitimate, etc. So I hope it wasn't too controversial for anyone. Try my best to be fair. I just want you all to know that both sides have really strong and compelling arguments, and that arguably speaking, and I almost say without argument, but arguably the most controversial country on earth is Israel, and it's because of all the things we've mentioned here. So I hope this made sense. I hope you all learned something. Go out and tell a friend about what you learned today, and I think that the more people that know about this issue, the better off the world will be, the more peaceful the world will be. That's hopefully the goal of everyone, right? Is no conflicts, nobody killed, and peace. So with that, peace out. God bless you all. Inshallah, we'll see each other soon, and I hope that everyone has a happy, healthy, safe, and sound week. Can't believe it's It's almost the new year. All right. All the best.